On Christmas Eve of 2019, the Manis family gathered in Muncie, Indiana, for what should have been a night of warmth and celebration. The air was cold, the streets quiet, and inside the home, the sounds of wrapping paper tearing and children's laughter carried through the rooms. Among them was 4-year-old Hayden Ian Lee Manis, small, bright-eyed, and full of the restless energy that came so naturally to him. That night, Hayden opened his presents with a wide smile. To those who loved him, he was simply a happy little boy, full of promise. No one in the room could have known it would be the last time most of them would ever see him. In the months that followed, Hayden seemed to slip quietly out of view. There were no more visits, no more family gatherings where he came running through the door. Birthdays passed without photographs. School years began without enrollment. Slowly, the presence of a little boy once so central to his grandfather's world faded into silence. And that silence would last for almost 5 years. What makes Hayden's disappearance so haunting is not just that he vanished, but that his absence went unrecognized for so long. There were no missing posters taped to streetlights, no television alerts, no desperate searches in the woods. Nothing. The last confirmed memory remained that Christmas Eve. Hayden laughing, playing with toys, a child still too young to tie his own shoes without help. And then, without explanation, without alarm, he was simply gone. How could a child vanish so completely, without anyone noticing? The answer lies not only in Hayden's life, but in the fractures of the family around him. Cracks that widened into chasms until a little boy could disappear into them. The story of Hayden's disappearance cannot be told without first understanding the family he was born into. At the center was his grandfather, Gary Manis, a man whose love for Hayden was immediate and unwavering. Gray was not just a grandparent. He was a constant presence in the boy's short life. Friends and neighbors would later recall how deeply attached he was, how every conversation seemed to circle back to Hayden's smile or his playful energy. But beyond Gary's devotion, the family was marked by conflict and instability. Hayden's life was intertwined with the fractures of his family. His parents, Dustin Manis and Terry Williams, were both arrested and incarcerated for drug abuse. His grandfather, Gary "Paw Manis, had been his guardian after his parents lost custody in 2016 due to the drug arrests. Yet those small years of safety ended when custody was granted back to Hayden's father, Dustin Manis, a man whose history of substance abuse alarmed family members. Even as Gary pleaded for Hayden's safety, the court returned the boy to his father's custody. That decision would set the stage for everything that followed. For Gary, these concerns grew heavier with time. He worried constantly, not just about Hayden's safety, but about whether the boy was being raised in an environment where love and attention were truly present. Yet, as much as Gary tried to stay connected, the fractures in the family often pushed him to the margins. By late 2019, these tensions had created a quiet but widening gap. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits grew rare. Still, Gary held on to the memory of Hayden sitting beside him, laughing at Christmas, and he told himself he would see his grandson again soon. But behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would change everything. Whether through neglect, indifference, or something far darker, Hayden's presence in his parents' lives began to fade. No daycare records, no school paperwork, no doctor visits. It was as if the family had closed ranks, and in doing so had hidden Hayden from the world. And yet, the silence surrounding his absence went unchallenged. For Gary, the fractures within his family were painful but familiar. What he could not know was that this time, those cracks would swallow an entire child. What makes Hayden's disappearance so haunting is not just that a child went missing, but that no one seemed to notice. From 2019 onward, Hayden slowly disappeared from the public record. For nearly 5 years, there were no official signs that Hayden even existed. It's a silence that feels impossible in today's world. A child vanishing without a trace usually sparks headlines, searches, and candlelight vigils. But in Hayden's case, the years passed quietly, and his absence was swallowed by shadows. The only person who continued to ask questions was Gary Manis. His calls to Dustin became increasingly desperate. Each time, the answers felt vague, hurried, evasive. He was told Hayden was fine, that he was with friends, or that things were complicated. Yet when Gary pressed harder, when he begged to see his grandson, doors were slammed shut. Friends who once visited the family's home stopped seeing Hayden altogether. Neighbors, too, began to notice. The laughter of a little boy that once echoed through the yard was gone. His toys sat untouched, weathered by sun and rain, and still no missing person report was filed. No welfare checks, no police knocking on doors. For the state, Hayden was invisible. For his parents, he was an absence they refused to explain. The vanishing years are perhaps the darkest part of this story, not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. How does a child vanish for half a decade in a modern community without anyone stepping forward? How does a life so small, yet so precious, slip between the cracks of family, neighbors, and society itself? By the time Hayden's disappearance finally reached the attention of authorities, it was far too late. 5 years had already been stolen, years that can never be returned. In April of 2024, the silence surrounding Hayden Manis finally broke. It began not with police, not with investigators, but with a single phone call. Hayden's grandfather, Gary Manis, had grown increasingly suspicious after years of being shut out. Something inside him refused to believe the excuses anymore. And so, he went to the one place he felt he might finally be heard, the Washington County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived at Dustin Manis's home in Muncie, Indiana, they expected confusion, perhaps even hostility. What they didn't expect was the chilling void that greeted them. No sign of a young boy, no clothes in drawers, no toys in the living room, no trace of a child who should have been 9 years old. The questions began simply: where is Hayden? When did you last see him? Dustin's answers were vague, stumbling. Dustin's cold and distant. The deeper authorities pressed, the more the story unraveled. First, he claimed Hayden was with family friends. Then, he had been sent to live elsewhere. Soon, his accounts contradicted each other entirely. The officers left that night with a gnawing certainty. Hayden Manis had not been seen in years. Word spread quickly through the small Indiana community. Neighbors who once assumed Hayden had moved away realized, with a sickening twist, that he hadn't been seen since 2019. Former acquaintances remembered the boy's sudden absence, the way Dustin stopped posting pictures, the silence that had settled over the household. The investigation that followed cracked open a horrifying reality. Hayden had not simply disappeared recently. He had been gone, utterly unaccounted for nearly half of his life. What had happened inside that home between 2019 and 2024? Where had Hayden gone? And why had no one reported him missing until now? The discovery was only the beginning. What came next would plunge this quiet Indiana community into a nightmare of secrecy, deception, and unanswered questions. Once the reality set in, that Hayden Manis had been unaccounted for since 2019, the sheriff's department moved swiftly. What had started as a welfare check transformed overnight into a full-scale criminal investigation. Detectives poured into the Manis home, cataloging everything. They looked for the smallest traces: clothing tags, children's toys, photographs, even medical records. But everywhere they turned, they met only silence. No recent school enrollment, no pediatric visits, not a single official document placing Hayden anywhere in the last 5 years. To investigators, it was as if the boy had been erased. Authorities quickly zeroed in on Dustin Manis. His conflicting statements were riddled with inconsistencies. He suggested Hayden had been taken in by someone who could care for him better. Later, he offered a different version, that Hayden had simply gone away years ago. He could not provide names, addresses, or proof. Meanwhile, the FBI joined the case, bringing their own forensic experts. Agents pulled phone records, bank statements, and internet searches, trying to piece together what Dustin had been hiding. But the most haunting detail came not from the parents, but from neighbors. Some recalled hearing Hayden cry in the years before his disappearance. Others spoke about how suddenly the noise stopped, how Dustin rarely let the boy play outside. One neighbor admitted they had thought about calling child services but never did. Now, in hindsight, that silence felt damning. The community watched in horror as each new development surfaced. For 5 long years, no Amber Alert was issued. No missing posters taped to utility poles. No desperate plea to the public. Because no one outside the family had even been told Hayden was gone. To investigators, that was the most chilling fact of all. Hayden wasn't missing in the traditional sense. He had simply vanished, and no one spoke his name. And so the investigation pressed forward with one burning question. If Hayden hadn't been seen since 2019, what exactly happened inside that house to silence him forever? The case of Hayden Manis leaves behind a void, not only in the records of law enforcement, but in the conscience of an entire community. How could a child vanish in 2019, and no one outside his own home realize it until 5 years later? How could neighbors notice his absence yet never demand answers? How could schools, doctors, and social workers fail to ask where Hayden had gone? The silence surrounding Hayden's life and his disappearance is as chilling as the unanswered questions that remain. Dustin Manis remains the central figure in the investigation. His stories contradict one another, his explanations evaporating under the slightest scrutiny, and he was later arrested on drug charges. Then, in late 2024, he died of a drug overdose. With him went the last direct link to Hayden's fate, and the investigation darkened with questions that may never be answered. So, without Dustin and without Hayden's body, or concrete proof of what became of him, investigators are left piecing together fragments of a mystery no parent should ever be capable of writing. The FBI has urged the public to come forward with any information, no matter how small, that could shed light on what happened to Hayden. But as of today, no definitive answers have surfaced. For the people of Muncie, Indiana, the case is a sobering reminder of how easily a child can disappear in plain sight, hidden not by strangers, but by the very people meant to protect him. Hayden Manis should be a teenager today, navigating high school, dreaming about the future. Instead, his name exists in police reports, news headlines, and whispered conversations about how long justice can be delayed before it disappears entirely. Until investigators find the truth, Hayden's story remains unfinished. And in that silence, one haunting question echoes louder than all the rest. Where is Hayden Manis?